Welcome back to Advertising is Dead. We're talking to Anurakt. I hear they call you AJ, so I don't know if I should stick to your full name or AJ. And I happen to notice that because someone from the team happened to drop that in chat before we hit record. So I'm first going to ask you, how do you prefer to be referred to as?
If you can call Anurakt, I'm absolutely fine with that. If you prefer that
Perfect.
you want to go with the abbreviation, AJ is fine as well.
I think maybe we'll do the first name. I don't think we'll come to the abbreviation point yet. Hopefully, by the end of the conversation, we'll come to that.
Done.
But firstly, thank you for coming on the show, and what I thought a good point to start with is to really kind of tap into where this all kind of started off. Where did the journey for club really start off? And then we'll get a little more broad based.
Sounds good. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show as well. Truly a pleasure. Congratulations on what you've built, and it's a privilege to be here speaking with you as well. Just in terms of the journey of Club, I think a lot of entrepreneurial journeys are seeded much more earlier in itself. And my journey as well lies. Its roots lie much earlier before club started out in itself.
Mm.
If I were
Mm.
to actually go back and retrace the steps, I'd say that becoming an entrepreneur started off with uh, an entrepreneurial project that I did in my undergrad, which
Mhm.
went nowhere. And so, literally, I'm talking a lot of years back when I did my first startup of sorts. I didn't even know it was a startup back then, but I came across the term entrepreneurship and venture capital, and I thought, aha, maybe I could enable other entrepreneurs who have
Mm.
better ideas. And that started me off on my journey about always figuring out new problems and innovative solutions to newer problems in itself, and that's been a
Mhm.
recurring theme in itself. So this is uh, probably an iteration in itself which has happened after 4 or 5 attempts in itself,
Mm.
either by myself, with other co-founders, or in a larger company in itself. So club in itself is a journey that has its roots elsewhere. um, we started out club finance side where we've tried to get capital to a lot of businesses, either as investment bankers or sitting on the investing side in itself. Enough and more
Mhm.
businesses, and we were starting out our own consumer brand in itself.
Okay.
When we spoke with a lot of founders, a lot of entrepreneurs trying to research that idea, uh, we heard a recurring problem. A recurring consistent problem was capital is not available. Please note this is
Mm.
pre-COVID. And so we
Mm.
said, hang on, why don't we solve this problem? We are finance people at the end of the day. Uh, we came across the term revenue-based financing for SaaS businesses in the US. And we said, why
Mhm.
don't we apply that a lot more broadly in a very, very customized manner for India? That got us started off on the journey for Club.
So, for someone who doesn't understand what revenue-based financing is, how would you explain it in a nutshell? Because it's not a commonly used term, but the more I've looked at it, it makes so much sense to have this as a larger trend rather than, like, I would say, a little smaller compared to everything you hear around venture capital, etc. So, um, for a layman, how would you explain it?
Yeah, it's actually a fairly simple concept in that we give capital to companies, but take back returns as a revenue share.
Hmm.
That's it. There is no equity dilution. There are no funky terms called warrants. There is no concept of a fixed EMI, and EMI is a term we hear of because all of us have some sort of a loan, a housing loan or a vehicle loan of sorts. So we've heard the
Hmm.
concept of equal monthly installment, but that's also a very different concept if you were to think about it. A simplest concept is we just take a share of revenue. Whatever you make in a month, a pre agreed percentage is taken back up until a certain return is made from that initial amount of capital that we have passed on to the company. That is the fundamental and the simplest way of understanding revenue based financing. A lot of people say that, hey, is it a Western concept? They look at these companies in the West that are doing revenue based financing. I'd argue that revenue based financing has always existed in India in the informal lending markets. So if you
Mm,
go down to tier two, tier three cities, small towns in itself, you will have local providers of capital who would take back returns as a revenue share in itself.
mm, mm,
What Club has done is it has just platformized that entire thinking on the back of digitization that has happened in the market and in the economy overall. But that's just the simplest way of explaining. We only take a pre agreed share of revenue up until a certain period of time, such that returns come back to us.
And when you think about this, obviously, what you always heard of for startups basically is that either you are figuring a way to self fund this, try and get a bank loan, which to my mind would seem for anyone hearing this right now is this like a bank loan would be a question. I'm sure it'll pop up. I'm sure you're tired of hearing people say, is this like a bank loan? And on the other side, there's venture capital, which obviously is taking equity in exchange for a certain amount of funds kind of coming in. um, how would this work differently from if these are obviously putting aside your own money if self-funded, but if you had to kind of compare this with how you work with startups versus how, let's say, venture capital works with them, or with how banks would kind of work with someone, how would that differ?
Yeah. So we sit somewhere in the middle between how banks operate and how
Mm,
venture capital operates. And let me explain both.
mm,
Let's start with venture capital in itself, where you give up a portion of your equity for a certain amount of capital. But the reason VC is coming in is because the VC believes that your business in itself is going to become much larger in terms of valuation over a period of time. And that share that they hold is going to become many-fold over a period of
mm,
time. So they are taking on a bet which involves the positive nature or the appreciation of the equity or the
mm,
valuation. And at the same point in time, they're taking full downside risk as well, which is if something goes wrong, then what?
yeah.
Then they are actually taking on the full impact. Let's compare and contrast this with bank loans. Banks are very clear. We don't care about how good you're doing or how bad you're doing. We just
Yeah.
care about a single fundamental predicate called EMI, equal monthly
Hmm.
installment. You have to give me my EMI no matter what.
Yeah.
Whether it's good times, bad times, give me back by EMI for the desired tenure that we have agreed upon. No
Mm,
questions asked. So they are not necessarily taking on as much fundamental risk, but they are taking on a different kind of risk in itself, which is why
mm,
the risk returns on both sides end up being different. Now, revenue based financing sits somewhere in the middle. What revenue based financing is saying is that we are not taking a 5, 7, 10 year time horizon view like equity.
mm,
Neither are we saying that the business needs to return a steady output regardless of how it performs.
yeah.
Business in itself always goes through its peaks and troughs. That is business reality. No business is a flatline business or just an exponential growth business in itself.
Yeah.
Business
Yeah.
reality is somewhat of weird curves in
Mm,
itself. What revenue based financing says is that during good months, the returns are higher, and during lean months, when revenue is low, the returns are also lower. So it is
mm,
skin in the game from that standpoint, in that the good is shared and the
yeah.
bad is actually absorbed together.
Mm.
But at the same point in time, it is not taking on a fundamental 5, 7, 10 year bet, which has a different risk return connotation in itself. So it sits somewhere in the middle, which is why the risk return sits somewhere in the middle as well.
It's also an interesting model to talk about in today's times, right? If you talk about like 2021 last year, when I mean you were hearing stories of venture funding for every single startup, there was so much kind of happening around that. Versus now, where to use the popularly used term, winter seems to have come. Not in actual weather, but it seems to be the term that's being used the most. If you see most articles out there about the startup ecosystem, not just India but globally, the overall sentiment has gone towards not just focus on revenue but really focus on paths to profitability. You're focusing on all those aspects. And the more that happens, something like this makes sense, because uh, I mean, at a fundamental level, all businesses need to make a profit eventually, sooner rather better, because that's why you exist. I mean, as much as we look at innovation and everything else, the fundamental truth of a business is that you are doing something to generate profitability. And I think revenue obviously plays a strong part, before you filter down all the other costs there. Now, when you work with a startup, um, how do you take that call? So, okay, this is a startup we want to work with, as a partner, and I know you use the term member, um, if I'm correct.
Partner. We
Because
utilize the word
partner, sorry,
partner.
partner, yes. Kind of come on. And you do have a set of tools you kind of use on that front as well. So if I explain, if I'm a startup today, and I'm saying, okay, this is it. I'm listening to this podcast, so this is interesting. This might actually be what I need, because I've just been worried that my only option was to figure a way to raise money from somewhere. I do have a certain amount of revenue that I generate. This might be the perfect avenue for me to take. What are your general parameters like when you look into it?
Sure. So before I respond to that question, let me actually
Mm.
start slightly differently. In
Mm-hmm.
that, a lot of narrative that we hear in today's media, I'll call it
About the
that,
winter.
about the winter is always either or.
Exactly.
You always hear polarizing opinions because that is how our brain receives it the best. But actual reality for that matter, not even business
Mm.
reality, is that it's a combination. It's not either or as much. It's not to say that it's either equity or debt. Any
Mm.
growing business actually ends up combining all forms of capital in its overall financing mix.
Yeah.
It's not an either or. It is designed for narrative building, for making it polarizing. But I'd argue that every growing business is looking at different forms of financing. Revenue based
Mm.
financing is one of them. It is,
Yeah.
again, not the end all be all, much like we would want to believe it. It is one of the options that businesses have to consider now, especially as they are constructing their overall capital pools. They need to look at equity, they need to look at bank debt, they need to look at SME financing, and they need to
Mm.
look at revenue based financing. That's where we come in. We are
Yeah.
one of the providers of capital to businesses as they grow. Now, just
Okay.
in terms of the main question in itself, we fundamentally believe that revenue based financing applies to businesses of all sizes and shapes and colors, if you will.
Yeah.
It is a fundamental need. Any growing business will need capital, and any growing business will try and construct, again, this optionality, if you will, across different pools in itself. So why not look at revenue as one of those pools as well? And that's why we've constructed this in a manner where we can work with early stage, growth stage, and late stage businesses. The smallest business that we work with does about a couple of lakhs of monthly revenue. The biggest
Mm.
business that we work with today does about 50, 60 crores of monthly revenue as well. So that's a full or spectrum difference, if you will, in the size of the company. And we're only going up higher on the other end and lower on this side of the funnel as well. So truly,
Mm.
we don't see scale to be a challenge as long as it's a revenue generating business, as long as a portion of the revenue is digital in nature, that we can track, that we can analyze, that we can understand, and so long as there is a certain predictability to the revenue that our models can understand and interpret, we'd be fine working with that particular business in itself. So we're actually quite broad in an overall setting and application perspective.
And you mentioned that when you obviously you started off with a slightly different focus, and you saw this as an opportunity, and it was largely for SaaS companies. And I understand why that would be, because you can track recurring revenue in SaaS a lot easier than if you're a product, or let's say you're D2C. Um, was there anything that you learned from the point of inception, let's say for the first mm, year odd, which is almost like, okay, this is how this can work better or differently from what we assumed it would be? Or was it largely, no, we've understood the model, this is how it's going to go? Did either companies who you ended up, giving that level of financing to, or anything else in the ecosystem? Did that surprise you, or was it did it go as per plan?
Got it. Um, Life of a startup is about rapid recalibration.
Yeah,
So
of course it
we
is.
obviously uh, we obviously had our fair share of evolution as well. But before evolution, I think there is still a phase called exploration.
Mm,
And so during exploration, we had a bunch of iterations, if you will, where we were thinking about ways that it could be done, it could not be done. Once we were done with the just the pure exploration in itself, we
mhm,
knew that, or we'd done enough research, we'd done enough of thesis building in itself, that we
mm,
knew why a particular Western business model construct cannot be directly applied to India and to Asia. So for us, we sort of had our fair share of exploration. Post that, once we were clear about what we are building, we were equally clear that you just can't take something from the West, apply to the East, and say, voila, it'll work.
mm. Yeah.
So we took on a few design choices, if you will, and those design choices are still unchanged for us. So it's been a couple of years from that point of decisioning. There is
Mhm,
always newer innovation that we keep on applying, but nothing has fundamentally changed in those axioms which led to those design choices in itself, which is why we are still a slightly different revenue based financing player compared to our peers,
mhm.
because we simply have not taken a Western business model, applied that to India, Asia, and said that it'll work in itself, or rather, it'll scale in itself.
And I asked you that because, you know, one of the core questions I get asked by a lot of our listeners is that we want to understand where, businesses are really going and how things are evolving. And one of the core questions they also have is, okay, if I'm looking to work for a startup, and that's a question that's come up a lot more in recent times. I know the term startup now is, I think, it's so broad that I don't even know what all falls under it, but it does come in there. The worry always is that, do I go after a high growth startup and take on that opportunity? Do I go on and work for a startup that seems to be a little more solid in terms of its business fundamentals, and are they generating revenue, are generating profit, which is something which I'm hearing a little more of in recent times. I think the first category came a lot more. So the question of fundamentals kind of comes in, and when I look at the operating model which you have, I can see there's a definite focus on that fundamental. So the fundamentals aren't in place in many ways. They might not necessarily be the right kind of partner who you might work with. So when you look at the startup landscape, and I want to kind of pull out a little bit, go a little broader on this, how do you see the startup landscape in India, the business landscape in India from a macro level today? Where do you think we find ourselves, and where do you think this is kind of like, if you, I'm not asking to be soothsayer, but I'm just saying at some point, where are you going to see this moving towards?
Yeah. So actually, I'm going to start off slightly differently and then zero in onto your question.
Hmm.
I think, first of all, startup is about a mindset.
Yeah.
It's not a size of company in itself. You will see very, very large companies operating like startups in as a totality or in pockets in itself. Usually it is in
Hmm.
pockets. So startup is more about a mindset where you're saying, I've identified a problem, I'm going to solve that problem, and it looks like it's going to be a unique solution for solving that particular problem. So it's problem
Hmm.
solving over and over again. Some of that problem solving in itself becomes an economic engine in itself, and you are
Hmm.
scaling up that economic engine such that it becomes repeatable and scalable, hopefully profitable over a period of time. But every such economic engine, after it scales, you will see large companies still being innovative. So say they will still spawn off newer startups in
Hmm.
pockets. I've been privileged to be part of one such startup in a larger behemoth as well,
Hmm.
and and so you're always going on that evolution, if you will, of solving problems in itself and converting them into larger economic engines in itself. Because I've had the privilege of seeing this ecosystem for quite a few years now. Right from undergrad, all I've been doing is working with startups in some form, shape, or manner,
Yeah.
buy side, sell side, inside a startup. I think a few things have changed fundamentally. Uh, and I talk about more than 15, 20 years back as well. The few things that have changed is that there is a lot more comfort with ambiguity and chaos than ever before. We are far more accepting of startup as a concept. It's a conversation that we now have in in our with our parents a lot more flexibly, thanks to things like Shark Tanks,
Yeah.
podcasts like yourselves that are happening, so on and so forth. That's one big change. So the overall angst associated with joining a startup, with building a startup, has come down fundamentally. The second big thing has that technology has leveled the playing field even further. Gone are the days when Silicon Valley was the only place where innovation could happen. We are seeing massive innovation coming out of pockets across the world, even in India at this point in time, because technology is now leveling a lot of uh, initial costs off in itself. The third equal important thing is that there is capital available. A startup fundamentally requires a certain gestation period, and someone has to fund and fuel that gestation period. And you're seeing enough and more forms of capital, of financing, that are willing to contribute towards that gestation phase in itself. And that capital in turn requires exits to happen. So I think for me, the biggest change that has happened in the ecosystem that we always spoke about but never really saw up until recent years is exits coming out. Our first set of companies have gone public. Our first set of startups have gone public. Our first set of acquisitions are happening locally, not just with international companies, but by startups acquiring other startups. You are now seeing that a failed startup in itself is celebrated, and it still gets an exit in itself. Or at least there is an acqui-hire concept that has started off. All of these are fundamental overall to evolution. Now, what I fear about a lot is always tulip craze, where everyone says that somewhere there is gold, or are the
Yeah.
money being printed left, right, and center. That's not the case. It's incredibly tough to build startups. It's incredibly tough to be a part of startups in itself.
Yeah.
And that's probably a course correction. We'd heard that during COVID as well, when there was a flight to safety, if you will. And we're now going to see this course correction again, which is again another flight to safety. So it's so much about a narrative where you will hear that, hey, startups are cool, and then startups are uncool. I can bet my money that in a few quarters from now, we will again be saying startups are cool.
Yes.
And then the funding
Yes, we
winter
will.
is over. We're back into spring season. So
Yes.
those of us who've seen enough cycles, we don't get bothered by them. And I'd argue that people who are truly trying to solve a problem, trying to find solutions, they shouldn't be either. These are phases, they come and go.
Now I have a bunch more questions to ask you, but I know we need to take a short break. So it's going to do that and be right back with advertising instead.
Hello, hello, hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On IVM Likes, Nehal, Antriksh, and Nikhil compile a list of their favorite patriotic movies on the occasion of Independence Day. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Puneet, Harsh, and Meghna chat about the political upheaval in Bihar. On Vartalab, Akash and Naveen chat with fellow comedian Sumit Saurabh about his outing on Amazon Prime Video, Vanch Karnash. On Do What Floats Your Boat, Danish speaks to YouTuber and gaming content creator Myth Pat, where they dive deep into the world of gaming. And on Marathi Khirki Tun, the Deshmukhs explain why protecting and conserving the environment is important. Once again, would like to remind you all about our merch. There's some amazing stuff out there. Please go to our website, ivmpodcast.com, click on the shop tab, and do check out what's available there. I'm sure you'll find something you like. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And also, I'd like to remind you all to please tell a friend about this show if you're enjoying it. It will give you somebody to talk to the show about. Yeah, it really does help us too, so that too. Also, please rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. and you can check us out on YouTube. We have a page on our website which basically lists all our YouTube channels. Please go check that out. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week, Boat Lifestyle, Small Case, and Intel vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to Advertising is Dead. We're still talking to Anuragt. I want to pick up from a different point post the break, right? Is the fact that you're a startup as well, and you obviously have built this company around a model which in many ways seems to be the need of the hour for many businesses right now. But what I want to ask you is, how did you go about building the team that you have? Because in what's not a traditional model, as we seem to know it in this market, you also, I'm gathering, didn't kind of go around with the traditional way of hiring and building a team. So what do you look for in the team that you kind of brought on, and how was that process kind of gone?
So we've actually always believed that there are a certain set of people that we want to attract, and there's a large category that we want to repel. We don't speak enough about repelling. We only
I
speak
agree.
about attracting a lot more. Part of our job is to clean up our funnels as much as is possible, because if our funnels are not optimized, including hiring funnels in this specific case, it just leads to more system time in activities where it should not be spent. So we actually set up our cultural framework much earlier. And it's always a debate, not a debate, but a question that people ask: hey, is the culture of a company strong or not? Culture is always evolutionary, but can you put it down? And can you be clear about what you stand for? At least we as a company try to do that, and are still trying to do that as early and as clearly as is possible. We have a slightly different way of speaking about our culture in itself. And let me spend a few minutes on that. It's an interesting segue because that will link back into your question in itself.
Yeah.
As we started thinking about it, we of course read all the literature out there about big companies, how their cultural tenets are created. And we realized that that didn't quite make sense for us. So we actually have a 4-tiered cultural tenet framework. The first layer, which is the foundational block, is what we call virtues. Virtues is something that we are assessing, but we are very, very clear we can't teach or train. Either you have it or you don't. If you don't have it, we absolutely recommend people to not apply at club, because virtues will come through in some interaction or the other, and people will find it extremely hard to build that competency in themselves over a period of time. So virtues is the first bedrock of our entire layer. The next one, what sits on top of that, is what we call the club wow. Wow stands for way of working. So this is the club way of working. There are 5 of these tenets that we can assure anyone coming in that they will be completely battle hardened around. You simply cannot spend even a few weeks at club and not be exposed to these 5 fundamental tenets in itself. And we keep on, as a team, we keep on building muscle around these 5 tenets in itself. So we over index on these 5 a lot more. On top actually sit our cultural tenets in itself. These 5 cultural tenets are actually more ambiguous than anything else. For us, culture is actually a journey in itself. And so the way that these tenets have been designed is that they are 2 ends of the spectrum, and you have to figure out where do you need to be at that point in time. Let me take an example just so that it makes sense.
Yeah.
One of our cultural tenets is think big and execute small. Just by thinking big, you don't get anywhere. Just by executing very minutiae, if you don't know where you're going, you also don't get anywhere. It's actually a combination that needs to be applied, where you're thinking big, you're actually having a bold vision out there, yet you're executing down to the minutest level possible. Hardest part is figuring out where you need to be on that spectrum. And so there are
Yeah.
these cultural tenets which are designed as oddities in itself. They are contrasts in itself, and you have to figure out where you stand at that in that contrast in itself as you build your mental models. At the apex, on the very top, sits the club's mission sits on top, which is enabling growth for loved brands. So that's the on the top. So whatever that we are doing, be it virtues, we are working, and our cultural tenets, all of them are designed such that we are able to get to our mission in itself. That is sacrosanct for us. That is the reason why we built club. That is the reason why we get a joy out of doing what we do. And I'd argue a lot of club team members do as well. So when we are assessing people, now into your question in itself, we are over indexing a lot on virtues. We are assessing whether the person will fit on our way of working in itself. Those are the two dimensions that we are assessing over and over again. And there are people who absolutely rate very high on the mission in itself. These are missionaries themselves, and so they also become automatic converts for us in itself. So it's a slightly different way that we're searching for people, but then we also try and spend a lot of time repelling. So we are trying to create more and more content such that people are aware about what club is, who we are as people, and that we're not a fun place. I'm sorry. We are not an adult crash, as we call it. Uh, we have a lot of responsibility in making sure businesses get capital. In fact, businesses die if they don't get capital. And it is our responsibility to make sure we do that effectively. We are handling people's money. It's a very, very serious responsibility that we undertake with as much seriousness as well. So we're very clear about some of these things that we've built as muscle over a period of time. And we try and push that out into the pool of applicants as well. Please be very clear about club before you apply.
You know, I think this way of putting it together is super interesting, but I think it also makes so much sense, right? And I think oftentimes I feel that a model like this also kind of takes you away from just putting vision, mission, plastering it on a wall, and then you're done, and you go ahead and you do what you do, and that tends to happen so often in businesses. But I'm actually most interested with the line you said, because I've always kind of believed in that, is that building a business doesn't have to be about fun. Doing your job well, doing what you're doing well in terms of what you're doing, in terms of what you're targeting, brings fun to itself. But I think there's a lot of over indexing on, oh, we need to make this a fun startup to work at, or we need to make this, like, where is that foosball table? Where is that um, ping pong table, to give the most cliched examples of what you would normally hear. But I think it makes sense to turn around and say this is a serious business, which is focusing on some very clear and serious goals, and this is how we work around it. Because in that way you attract the right kind of talent, and like you said, you also repel the kind which you don't necessarily feel will fit into how you build your business. So I'm pretty aligned to saying that I agree with your model, and I also think it's a little refreshing for me to hear as well, compared to everything else, which you tend to hear very often. I'm not saying anything is good, or I'm not comparing here as much as I'm saying that it's refreshing to see it in this sense of the word.
Completely agree on that, Varun. In fact, we are also not in the business of making judgments. We are not saying one is good or bad. We are just saying this is who we are, this is what we stand for, and we have a lot of fun. But work is work and fun is fun. Work is not
Exactly.
fun in the sense of making it as we call it, an adult crash.
I'm going to borrow some of these terms. You give me a few terms to kind of borrow. One of the things I enjoy from the podcast is I always get to learn newer terms which I can kind of use and make myself seem smarter in that sense. And so speaking of smarter, are there certain categories in the business that you largely focus on? You're bullish about, so these are areas which seem to be doing well, and you are saying, okay, these are categories which seem to work well, or are you still pretty much taking to a broad-based approach?
We are sticking to a simple approach that was, again, a design choice for us much earlier on, in that all businesses are good. And that's a very weird statement to make. But we actually start out from a position of trust. We start out from a position of every business is good, regardless of its size, scale, sector, color, what have you.
Mm.
We are in the business of assessing risk of that particular investment opportunity. So the same business
Mm.
can have different kinds of risk at different points in time. We are in the business of assessing that risk, expecting a return commensurate to that risk, and
Mm.
then matching it to a pool of capital. That's what our fundamental design choice was. So in our internal meetings, we don't speak about, hey, this business is good or this business is bad. We are always talking about how do we present a financing option to this particular business such
Mm.
that it matches the risk return framework that we have in place. Ergo, we actually were always broad from a sectoral standpoint. We go after what we call digital businesses and new economy SMEs. Ultimately,
Mm.
what we believe is that COVID has only accelerated digitization. A lot of businesses, not just D2C brands, but also online marketplace sellers, cloud kitchens, SaaS companies, edtech companies, subscription businesses, even literally an offline business with a POS system and a billing system is well
Yeah.
within scope for Club. It was a very conscious design choice. It was a very conscious axiom that a lot of businesses are going to get digitized increasingly more so over a period of time. And we should be there for them, with them, as they build their businesses, as they scale up over a period of time.
Um, Towards the later part of every episode, I ask my guest a set of questions, deviating from the seriousness of some of the questions we have before that, because you talk about business, talk about everything else. This is more for people to kind of get an understanding of you as an individual, as a professional. So, is this what you set out to do when you started off your career? This is what you wanted to build. You wanted to be an entrepreneur. Did you want to work in this sector? What did you set out to be when you started off your journey?
Yeah, so my journey, again, going back to that first failed startup in undergrad, was
Mm,
coming across the term entrepreneurship and venture capital.
mm,
And back in undergrad, these were magical terms for me. I mean, I'm
yeah,
talking circa many, many years back. I'm talking 2002, when entrepreneurship and venture capital were not known terms in India.
exactly.
And I had my epiphany then that if I could enable other entrepreneurs who are truly building great things, then that's a life worth living. That's that's something I can imagine myself doing for a lifetime in itself and feel very, very
Mm,
fulfilled, feel very, very gratified. And so it's just been that journey. And one way or the other, first getting into investment banking because I was trying to get into venture capital, then getting my break in venture capital in itself, doing that for a few years in itself, realizing that I still had to learn more, moving to the operational side, building businesses within a larger business in itself, which was in Mobi.
mhm,
All of these experiences have just helped me get to where we are today. And
mm.
so I actually feel limited deviation in terms of where I started out and where I am. And I find that extremely fulfilling. Ultimately, there is a problem, there's a solution, and we are trying to solve a problem and a solution. So, regardless, we're just going to be doing this.
And beyond work, what do you spend a lot of your time doing? What keeps your interest, and what's your I don't like the word hobby. I like to feel that there are things that we do outside of work. So what keeps you kind of going? What are your other areas of interest?
So, my other areas of interest are very, very cliched, unfortunately. But I'll tell you the non cliched one, which I don't think is a hobby. It sounds weird, but I
Mm,
actually love meeting people.
mm.
It sounds weird, but no
Not
one
at all.
has called it a
You're talking to
hobby.
a podcaster here, so I totally am on the same boat. So I'm like,
I just love meeting new people, understanding what they are doing, what they're building, how are they thinking. A lot of it is just about connecting weird, disparate thoughts.
Mm.
People call it connecting the dots, but I'm just building more and more mental models, if you will. And the more people I
Mhm.
interact with, the more mental models I can create, understand, appreciate in itself. So
Mm.
I've been asked this question multiple times, what's your hobby? And it sounds very weird when I say this, that I love meeting people. At some given point in time, I was called a power networker. Now I hate that term. It means nothing. It's actually very ephemeral in nature. But I realize
Yeah.
that I always like going deeper into understanding how mental models are made, how people think. Other than that, reading books and just binge watching anything as a detoxing mechanism, apart from
Mhm.
music.
Mhm.
Those would be more conventional, if you will. But
Mhm.
a lot of people say this, that as you start building a business, you stop reading as much. They have this common gripe in that they stop reading.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not in the case for both Ishita and I as founders. We actually, again, enjoy reading because it keeps giving us new perspectives and mental models to sort of work on, to improvise and evolve on further.
Um, what can you put together in an instant?
I would say that what I can put together in an instant would be an idea, a problem solution mix. I think
Mhm.
those come very, very naturally to me. So it's
Mhm.
the brain is always searching for, if there's a problem, what's the solution in itself? So that's the instantaneous thing for me. I'm not saying right,
Um,
wrong. I'm not saying about the speaking about the quality of the output. I'm just saying
yeah.
that that's how the
Yeah.
brain is wired.
And this is actually a question I like to ask, in especially a co-founder case. How Because there are generally roles that co-founders play. I think each brings something to the table also. So, how are you as a co-founder, and how what kind of gets filled up from the other end?
Yeah. So I'm actually again going to take off on a tangent and then come back to the
Please do.
question itself. A lot of people speak about co-founders in terms of complementarity. I've heard
Mm.
enough podcasts and startup wisdom say, hey, you should have complementary team members who are building in different skill sets. I think what is not spoken about enough is the number one trait, which is trust between co founders.
Yeah.
It's actually a ridiculously hard journey in itself. And there are so many decisions that you are taking at multiple points in time in a day that if you don't have trust fundamentally, a lot of things will
Mhm.
break down. All complementarity breaks down in itself. Um, and so I've had the privilege, the luxury, and the good fortune of working on an idea with my co-founder many years back.
Mhm.
That startup idea failed, and we became friends. So we've actually tried to work on an idea, tried to work on a startup, yet we know each other personally as well as friends. So we've
Mhm.
actually evolved over many years. And then we got this opportunity next time around to do this again after
Yeah.
having fairly good professional careers that were somewhat complementary, somewhat different, but yet in the same realm that it comes together. So we are finance
Yeah.
people who are coming in together, but
Yeah.
Ishta has had a slightly different evolution than what I've had, and that kind of
Mhm.
helps. Now, going back to your question, startup founding teams are also constructed in different manners. People have either functional responsibilities, and so you would see some particular functions being tagged to some founders, if you will, or founding
Mhm.
pairs. Another way that uh, we've heard is inward facing and outward facing in itself.
Mhm.
That's another way to construct it as well. And we sort of had our own evolution, if you will, which is more around the kind of responsibilities, if you will.
Mhm.
So it's a combination of functional, but managed slightly differently. So we actually maintain it slightly differently. We internally call it a threads framework. So which thread,
Mhm.
who is looking after which thread. We also have outward and inward responsibilities as well. But
Mhm.
most of it is geared around what our natural strengths are. So I tend to be more on the outward facing side, doing more of the BD side, the fundraising side, being the face of the company. But
Mm.
Ishita, on the other hand, she is the hardcore operations person. She runs everything at club.
Mm.
And I wouldn't even mince words saying this. So she's the actual COO,
Mm.
who is plugged into all threads and who's doing load balancing across all of them.
Mm.
Startups are a lot about prioritization. And so
Mm.
effective prioritization in itself becomes a lot more challenging when you have an economic engine and you're innovating on top simultaneously. So all needs to be managed, and which is what Ishita handles.
Um, you mentioned a little earlier that reading is a core focus. Anything you read recently that you'd recommend?
This is going to be again slightly weird. I can tell you what I'm reading right now. It's a
Mm.
very weird book called The Denial of Death.
Okay, I'm intrigued already.
um, what this book is about is that a lot of our decisions are taken in life when we are evading from this fundamental reality of life, which is death.
Mm. Yeah.
And as children, we understand death much earlier, but then we layer it on to survive.
Mhm.
And when you start becoming in touch, it's kind of like quasi Buddhist philosophy as well. When you
Mm.
start being in touch with that reality that life is ephemeral, you unlock
Yeah.
a lot more from yourself in itself. Hence the
Mm.
denial of death.
No, I think the concept of death has suddenly become a conversation point in a far deeper sense in recent years, and I think rightly so because it's. I don't think that's the one thing none of us can ever evade. So I think it makes sense. But thank you so much for coming on the show because you left me at a point, and this is a topic which I'm also because I read a lot about stoicism and I get into like memento mori and that entire side of things. So we're ending this one on a slightly more, I'd say, thoughtful point. But thank you so much for coming on the show for not just explaining the model, but to really talk about. I think for me, one of the key takeaways is how you spoke about culture. I think that's I found it refreshing that culture is looked at in that sense at club, and I think there's more to take from that. I'm especially taking the adult crush uh, from you as a story. But thank you so much for coming on the show and for letting not just me but all our listeners kind of learn a bit about how this form of financing and this form of working with startups can actually be a lot more, I'd say, it's a lot more solid in terms of what it can do for businesses which are focused on the fundamentals, at least the way I've kind of understood it, and in terms of the potential. And obviously, there's so much more that can happen around it. And so, thank you for coming on the show. And we hope to get you back in at some point of time. And as your journey evolves and the journey of this podcast evolves as well.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for having me over as well. It was very refreshing to have a conversation around different dimensions, different topics as well. Um, Really rooting for the success of the podcast as well, and look forward to joining in the future at some given point in time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.